In the aftermath of the Munich Agreement in September 1938, the European geopolitical landscape began to fracture. Czechoslovakia, a multi-ethnic state forged from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the First World War, was dismembered under pressure from Nazi Germany and its neighbors. On March 14, 1939, the Slovak Republic declared independence under the protection of Adolf Hitler. The new state, led by Catholic priest Josef Tiso, became a de facto client of the Third Reich. It was within this context of shifting allegiances and nationalist aspirations that Slovakia's participation in World War II would quietly unfold. Despite its modest size and resources, the Slovak Republic aligned itself with Germany for pragmatic and ideological reasons. Politically, Slovak leaders sought to secure the survival of their newly established state, which relied heavily on German military and economic support. The country lacked significant industrial capacity and had a population of approximately 2.6 million. Militarily, Slovakia inherited only part of the former Czechoslovak armed forces, giving rise to a relatively under-equipped army divided into field units and auxiliary formations. In terms of strategic considerations, the Slovak leadership viewed the alliance with Nazi Germany as a safeguard against Hungarian and Polish territorial claims. Hungary, having annexed parts of southern Slovakia after the First Vienna Award in 1938, remained a potential threat. Polish-Slovak border tensions had also flared sporadically. Germany's dominance in Central Europe appeared irreversible at the time, leading Bratislava to align itself with the emerging continental. Public sentiment within Slovakia was ambivalent. While the ruling Hlinka Slovak People's Party promoted strong nationalist and clericalist ideals in line with the regime in Berlin, much of the population remained politically passive or skeptical of foreign entanglements. The government utilized propaganda and political policing to cultivate loyalty, but resistance and dissatisfaction, both passive and later active, persisted beneath the surface. Slovakia's military commitment to Germany's campaigns began early. In September 1939, the Slovak Field Army Group Brnolak, consisting of 3 infantry divisions totaling roughly 5,000 men, participated in the invasion of Poland. This operation marked the first military deployment of Slovak forces in coordination with the Wehrmacht. The campaign allowed the regime to demonstrate loyalty to Berlin, regain disputed border territory, and test the readiness of its newly formed military. The success of the Polish campaign and the relatively low cost to Slovak forces reinforced Bratislava's belief in the benefits of its German alliance. As the war shifted eastward and preparations for a major conflict with the Soviet Union took shape in 1940 and 1941, Slovakia's political and military leadership was again called upon to participate. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, would soon become the central theater of the war. Despite initial hesitation among some Slovak officers, the government committed troops to the campaign. This decision aligned with its foreign policy objectives, including a desire to prevent Hungary from claiming sole influence over Ukrainian territories, and to affirm its commitment to the Axis cause. The Slovak military contribution to Barbarossa was organized around the Slovak Mobile Group, a mechanized formation consisting of approximately 5,000 men. It was composed of 1 reinforced motorized infantry regiment, a reconnaissance group, and supporting artillery. Unlike the earlier Polish campaign, this force would be deployed deeper into hostile territory, facing logistical strain, Soviet resistance, and unfamiliar terrain. The Slovak Mobile Group advanced into Ukraine alongside German Army Group South, entering Soviet territory through Galicia. Its initial tasks involved guarding lines of communication, securing captured towns, and engaging isolated Soviet units. While the formation operated under its own Slovak officers, it was subordinated to German command structures operationally. This integration created tensions in autonomy and accountability, especially as operations progressed. As early reports from the front emerged, a picture developed of both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, Slovak forces experienced relative success in the early weeks of Barbarossa. seizing key objectives and operating effectively in coordination with German units. On the other hand, inadequate equipment, poor supply chains, and limited mechanization hindered sustainability. Communications difficulties between German and Slovak commands occasionally led to operational confusion. Simultaneously, the regime in Bratislava used the participation on the Eastern Front to promote internal unity. Media outlets praised the bravery of Slovak soldiers and emphasized the ideological dimensions of the struggle against Bolshevism. State institutions encouraged enlistment and framed the campaign as both a defense of national interests and a religious war against atheistic communism. This messaging, however, failed to fully conceal growing discontent among some conscripts and officers, many of whom viewed the Soviet campaign as a German war in which Slovak lives were expendable. Slovakia's deeper engagement in the war also raised ethical and legal challenges. As Axis forces occupied Ukrainian territories, questions emerged regarding the treatment of civilians, the handling of prisoners of war, and participation in anti-partisan actions. While there is limited documentation of direct Slovak involvement in atrocities during this early phase, their integration into German operations blurred the lines of accountability. Later phases of the war would make these issues more explicit. By the autumn of 1941, the limitations of Slovakia's military capacity became apparent. Losses in personnel and material, along with political concerns at home, led to a reorganization of Slovak forces in the east. The government dissolved the Mobile Group and replaced it with the Security Division, a restructured unit tasked primarily with rear area security, guarding supply lines, and combating Soviet partisans. This transition marked a shift from frontline engagements to occupation duties, reflecting both practical necessity and political caution. Thus, as the first year of Operation Barbarossa unfolded, Slovakia's role on the Eastern Front, though modest in scale, became increasingly complex. It entailed not only military cooperation with Germany, but also entanglement in the broader dynamics of occupation, ideological warfare, and Axis geopolitics. While often overshadowed by the actions of larger Axis powers, the Slovak Republic's participation in the war against the Soviet Union was rooted in a combination of opportunism, coercion, and strategic calculation. As the campaign deepened and Soviet resistance hardened, these choices would bring new challenges and consequences. The outbreak of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, set in motion the full mobilization of Slovakia's military support for Germany's Eastern campaign. While the initial deployment of the Slovak Mobile Group had been presented as a limited commitment, events on the ground rapidly drew the Slovak state into a more prolonged and complex role. The initial advances across western Ukraine yielded quick tactical successes, but they also revealed the operational limitations and strategic vulnerabilities of Slovakia's military apparatus. The Mobile Group, under the command of Colonel Rudolf Pilfusek, was organized to operate semi-independently, but under overall German supervision. Its composition included the Motorized Infantry Regiment Martin, a bicycle battalion, artillery, engineers, and logistical support, amounting to roughly 5,000 men. Compared to its German counterparts, the unit was lightly armored and inadequately equipped for sustained mobile warfare. Its vehicles were often outdated, and it lacked sufficient spare parts and fuel reserves for deep penetration into Soviet territory. As it moved across Galicia and into the Ukrainian SSR, the Slovak Mobile Group encountered Soviet resistance in scattered engagements. Most notably, it participated in the occupation of Tarnopol and advanced towards Borov and Proskurov. The combat was uneven. Soviet Red Army units, often retreating in disarray, offered limited coordinated opposition. However, Slovak troops were increasingly involved in rear area security tasks, including anti-partisan patrols, logistical route protection, and population control in occupied villages. The Wehrmacht's high command initially regarded Slovak forces as politically reliable but militarily fragile. German officers expressed concern over morale, discipline, and the tactical performance of Slovak troops. Supply issues were a constant problem, compounded by overstretched transport routes and the limited capacity of the Slovak logistical corps. Slovak units often had to rely on German provisions or requisition food and supplies from the local population, creating tension and administrative friction in occupied zones. Despite these difficulties, Slovak commanders sought to preserve operational independence and demonstrate loyalty to the Axis cause. The Slovak government dispatched regular military observers to the front to assess conditions and bolster morale. Tiso's regime emphasized the ideological unity of the Axis, framing the campaign as a Christian nationalist crusade against Soviet atheism and Slavic Bolshevism. Soldiers were often told they were protecting Slovakia's long-term security and contributing to the moral and political regeneration of Europe. The first reports of casualties began to reach Bratislava in the summer of 1941. Though relatively limited in number, these deaths began to affect public perception of the war. As coffins returned home and letters from the front described harsh conditions, enthusiasm began to wane. In response, state propaganda intensified its messaging. Military funerals were used as nationalistic spectacles. Newspapers highlighted acts of bravery, while downplaying strategic setbacks or logistical shortcomings. The initial Slovak commitment was not designed for long-term operations deep inside the Soviet Union. By late August, with the front lines moving rapidly toward the Dnieper, the logistical strain proved unsustainable. Vehicles broke down in large numbers, spare parts were exhausted, and medical support faltered. Disease, especially dysentery and typhus, spread among poorly supplied units. Coordination with German units also became more strained, particularly as German priorities shifted toward encirclement operations around Kiev and beyond. German High Command proposed that Slovak units be reassigned to rear area duties where their manpower could be more effectively used. On September 27, 1941, the Slovak Mobile Group was officially disbanded, and its remnants were reorganized into the Slovak Security Division, Zaisťovacia Divizia. This new formation was charged with maintaining control over occupied territory, countering partisan threats, and supporting German logistical operations. The Security Division, numbering approximately 7,000 men, was stationed in the area around Zhytomyr and Kiev. Unlike the previous combat formations, it was structured explicitly for occupation tasks. Its soldiers manned checkpoints, patrolled roads, protected rail lines, and conducted anti-partisan sweeps. In practice, this often brought Slovak troops into direct contact with the civilian population, raising new questions about the nature of their presence and the conduct of operations. Though not initially implicated in war crimes, the division operated within the same general framework as German rear security units, which carried out mass executions of Jews, political commissars, and suspected partisans. While evidence of Slovak involvement in such actions remains limited, the division's cooperation with German Einsatzgruppen and Ordnungspolizei units suggests at least tacit complicity in the broader occupation system. Reports from Soviet and post-war sources suggest that some Slovak patrols assisted in roundups and shared intelligence with German forces. Morale within the security division declined over time. Many conscripts had not volunteered for service in the East, and the routine of occupation duties, exposure to guerrilla activity, and harsh environmental conditions contributed to psychological fatigue. Slovak officers reported increasing cases of insubordination, desertion, and illness. Requests for repatriation mounted, as did the difficulty of maintaining discipline in isolated garrisons with limited contact with the home front. Back in Slovakia, the government faced growing disillusionment among the public. While the official narrative continued to glorify the Eastern Campaign, civilian hardships, rising inflation, food shortages, and political repression eroded the legitimacy of the regime. In response, the Tiso government increased police surveillance and tightened control over the press. It also offered material incentives for military service, including pay increases and family subsidies for soldiers on the front. At the same time, the war in the East began to enter a more violent and unpredictable phase. With the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow in December 1941 and the growing activity of partisan formations in Ukraine and Belarus, Axis forces found themselves increasingly bogged down. The Slovak Security Division, ill-equipped and poorly trained for counterinsurgency warfare, struggled to adapt to the demands of rear-area warfare in a hostile environment. Thus, by the end of 1941, the nature of Slovakia's military role had fundamentally shifted. What began as a campaign of mobile cooperation with German forces had transformed into an extended and uncertain presence in contested territory. The Slovak government, having committed itself to Hitler's war in the East, now faced mounting political, military, and moral dilemmas. These would only intensify in the months ahead, as the Red Army began to recover and Axis fortunes waned. In early 1942, the shifting military situation on the Eastern Front compelled both German and satellite forces to re-evaluate their strategic posture. For the Slovak Republic, this meant redefining its role from that of a temporary contributor to a long-term participant in Germany's war against the Soviet Union. The transformation of Slovak forces into an occupation-oriented formation did not occur in a vacuum. It was shaped by political imperatives at home, Germany's evolving needs, and the growing resistance in the rear areas of Ukraine. The establishment of the Slovak Security Division was not merely an ad hoc solution to the overstretched logistics of the mobile group. It was also an attempt to maintain Slovakia's visibility as a loyal Axis partner. The division, composed of around 7,000 troops, was spread across towns and villages in Ukraine, particularly in the Zhytomyr-Berdyshev region. Its primary mission was to secure transportation corridors, suppress partisan activities, and support the broader occupation infrastructure. In practice, these tasks blurred the line between military operations and policing functions. From the German perspective, the value of the Slovak contingent lay in its ability to relieve German troops from secondary duties. Rear security in the vast Soviet territories consumed large numbers of personnel, especially as the Soviet partisan movement began to expand rapidly. By late 1942, partisan attacks against supply convoys, railways, and isolated outposts had become a frequent occurrence in Ukraine and Belarus. Slovak troops were deployed to guard rail junctions, escort German supply transports, and patrol rural areas vulnerable to partisan infiltration. To facilitate this role, the German military provided Slovak units with guidance, but not always adequate support. Arms and equipment remained outdated. Communications infrastructure was rudimentary, and command structures were stretched thin. This placed additional burdens on Slovak officers, many of whom lacked experience in counterinsurgency operations. Moreover, linguistic and cultural barriers made interaction with the local population difficult. This isolation heightened tensions and often led to harsh reprisals when attacks occurred. The operational doctrine of the Slovak Security Division reflected the broader German occupation policy, which increasingly emphasized control through intimidation and violence. While the division did not have the authority or logistical capacity to conduct mass reprisals on the scale seen in German operations, it did cooperate with German police battalions and Einsatzgruppen in certain cases. Reports from the period include references to joint patrols, intelligence sharing, and security sweeps targeting suspected partisan sympathizers. One particular aspect of Slovakia's role in the East that received less attention was the interaction between soldiers and the civilian population. In many towns, Slovak units served as garrison forces and became de facto representatives of the Axis occupation. While some units tried to maintain cordial relations, distributing food or offering basic medical assistance, others took a more adversarial approach, especially when casualties from ambushes or sabotage led to retaliatory measures. This pattern mirrored a broader dilemma for all occupying forces, the tension between maintaining order and alienating the population. On the home front, the Slovak government walked a careful line. Josef Tiso's regime needed to demonstrate its loyalty to Berlin while also containing domestic unrest. The war was increasingly unpopular among the rural population, who saw little benefit in the state's involvement in distant campaigns. To sustain the war effort, the regime relied on propaganda, incentives, and coercion. Posters glorified the Eastern Front as a Christian struggle against atheistic communism, and newspapers routinely published success stories from the front. However, personal letters and returning veterans painted a more complex and often grim picture of the occupation experience. By mid-1942, Slovak military planners recognized the limits of their presence in the east. The security division, although nominally effective, was under constant strain. Deserters began appearing among its ranks, especially as the brutality of anti-partisan warfare escalated. The High Command in Bratislava considered rotating units back to Slovakia more frequently and debated reducing the overall deployment to the Soviet Union. These discussions, however, were tempered by political realities. Any sign of withdrawal could be interpreted by Berlin as unreliability. Germany, meanwhile, had entered a new phase of the campaign. The focus shifted southward toward the oil-rich Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad. Army Group South required more resources, and security in the rear became increasingly critical to maintaining supply lines and railways stretching back to Poland and beyond. In this context, Slovakia's continued participation, however limited, was welcomed by the German High Command. In August 1942, elements of the Slovak Security Division were redeployed to support German operations near Kharkiv. Though not intended for frontline combat, these units were often placed in contested areas where partisans and regular Red Army forces operated in tandem. The situation further blurred the lines between occupation and warfare. Slovak casualties increased, and the strain on command cohesion became more apparent. Some officers filed reports expressing frustration with contradictory orders from German liaison officers, unclear jurisdiction, and insufficient reinforcements. At the same time, a lesser-known dimension of Slovakia's involvement emerged: the recruitment of Slovak nationals for auxiliary roles within the German military and SS structures. While not officially sanctioned as state policy, individuals, particularly ethnic Germans from Slovakia, the Carpathian German minority, volunteered for service in Waffen-SS units. Estimates suggest that several thousand Slovak citizens served in such capacities, with motivations ranging from ideological conviction to promises of better pay and status. The broader economic impact of the war also began to manifest. Slovakia's economy, already dependent on German trade, was further militarized. Industries shifted toward war production. Agricultural exports increased, and labor shortages intensified. To compensate, the regime introduced forced labor policies and conscripted workers for deployment in Germany and occupied territories. This, in turn, created resentment among urban and rural populations alike, who felt the costs of the alliance more acutely. By late 1942, with the German advance stalled at Stalingrad and Soviet forces mounting significant counteroffensives, the mood in Bratislava became increasingly anxious. Slovakia's leadership continued to express official support for Germany, but private communications within the Ministry of Defense and Foreign Affairs revealed growing doubts. Reports from military attachés warned of low morale, deteriorating discipline, and fear among soldiers of becoming trapped if the front collapsed. The security division remained operational in Ukraine, but its functions were increasingly reactive. Anti-partisan operations intensified, but success was elusive. Soviet resistance adapted, often avoiding direct confrontation while maintaining pressure on Axis garrisons. The longer the occupation lasted, the more it bred local opposition, not only to German authorities, but to all Axis forces, including the Slovaks. By the end of 1942, Slovakia's involvement in the war had evolved into a burdensome commitment. What had begun as a gesture of alliance and ambition had become a slow entanglement in a brutal conflict far from home. The political leadership in Bratislava still hoped for a German victory, but signs of strain, both military and civilian, were becoming difficult to ignore. The coming year would test Slovakia's resolve further, as the Eastern Front entered a period of reversal and reckoning. As 1943 began, the Eastern Front underwent a profound transformation. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February marked the first major strategic reversal for the Axis in the Soviet Union. The encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army, along with large portions of Romanian and Italian forces, sent shockwaves through Germany's coalition partners. In Bratislava, Slovakia's military and political leadership were forced to confront a new reality. The war was no longer a one-directional advance, but a struggle for survival on a front that now showed signs of collapse. Slovakia's security division, still stationed in Ukraine, found itself increasingly exposed. With German forces retreating from the Volga and Soviet momentum growing, the rear areas once considered stable became contested again. Soviet partisans, emboldened by the Red Army's advances, intensified their attacks. Railroads, depots, and garrison posts, many under Slovak responsibility, were targeted with growing frequency. Ambushes became deadlier, and improvised explosive devices were used more effectively. Patrols began to suffer increasing casualties. The security division responded by escalating its own operations. Slovak forces conducted large-scale sweeps through forests and villages, often in coordination with German security units. These actions involved arrests, interrogations, and, in some cases, destruction of suspected partisan bases. In practice, however, many of these operations yielded limited results, as partisans employed fluid, decentralized tactics and relied on sympathetic local populations for shelter and supplies. The result was a cycle of violence and repression that consumed resources and undermined any chance of cooperation with civilians. The harsh conditions of the Ukrainian winter compounded the situation. Poor infrastructure, unreliable supply lines, and inadequate winter clothing took a toll on morale and health. Desertion became more common, particularly among conscripts who had no ideological commitment to the Axis cause. Some Slovak soldiers reportedly defected to partisan groups or simply abandoned their posts, hoping to return home. Reports from the front describe increasing problems with alcoholism, discipline, and insubordination within garrison units. German military authorities, who had long viewed the Slovak security division as a secondary asset, began to question its usefulness. Liaison officers sent critical reports to Army Group South, noting low combat effectiveness and poor morale. However, Germany lacked the manpower to fully replace Slovak forces, especially as casualties mounted and resources were diverted to rebuild shattered divisions. Thus, Slovak units remained in place, performing duties that were increasingly dangerous and politically sensitive. Meanwhile, back in Slovakia, internal tensions were building. The regime's reliance on German support created a political dilemma. While outwardly loyal, several figures within the Slovak military and government began to consider the long-term viability of continued alliance with the Reich. Secret communications between Slovak diplomats and neutral embassies in Switzerland and Sweden reflect cautious inquiries about potential post-war settlements. Though these contacts did not yet constitute active resistance, they revealed growing unease within elite circles. Public opinion, too, continued to erode. As news of Axis setbacks filtered through censored newspapers and returning soldiers, confidence in the war effort declined. Increasing numbers of families received death notices or news of missing relatives. Despite official efforts to maintain a patriotic narrative, Slovak society became more divided. Urban workers protested deteriorating conditions, and rural communities resented forced conscription and agricultural levies. Black markets flourished, and underground resistance networks, still fragmented, began to re-emerge. In an attempt to reassert control, the regime introduced stricter measures. Internal security services expanded surveillance, arrested suspected dissenters, and tightened control over military recruitment. New incentives were introduced to encourage continued service on the Eastern Front, including higher wages, promises of land, and educational benefits. These efforts, however, could not reverse the fundamental reality. The strategic situation in the East was deteriorating rapidly. By spring 1943, the Red Army had regained large portions of eastern Ukraine and was preparing for renewed offensives. The German response was Operation Citadel, the planned encirclement of the Soviet salient near Kursk. This operation, which would become the largest tank battle in history, required significant German resources and left secondary sectors, including occupation zones, underdefended. Slovak units in central Ukraine were thus left with greater responsibility but fewer support assets. Slovak commanders received orders to consolidate their positions, reduce exposure to partisan ambushes, and focus on protecting key transport hubs. In practice, this meant abandoning smaller outposts and concentrating forces in larger towns, which were then fortified against potential Soviet raids. This shift reflected both strategic necessity and declining confidence in the ability of Slovak troops to control wide swathes of countryside. The Battle of Kursk, launched in July 1943, ended in failure for the Germans and marked the end of large-scale Axis offensives on the Eastern Front. In its aftermath, the Soviet Union launched a series of counteroffensives that rapidly reclaimed territory. Slovak units found themselves operating behind a crumbling line, increasingly isolated and vulnerable to partisan encirclement. Some detachments were withdrawn westward under German escort, while others remained in place, attempting to delay Soviet advances. It was during this phase that reports of atrocities began to surface. As partisan warfare intensified and Slovak casualties mounted, retaliatory actions against suspected collaborators became more frequent. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were subjected to punitive measures. While such actions were often initiated by German forces, Slovak patrols sometimes participated or provided logistical support. Post-war testimonies from local civilians and Soviet investigators include accounts of joint operations resulting in civilian deaths and destruction of property. The Slovak High Command, increasingly aware of the untenable situation, began planning a partial withdrawal. However, German authorities, fearing the political implications of a Slovak retreat, insisted that their forces remain in Ukraine as long as possible. This created a growing rift between Bratislava and Berlin. Slovak officers submitted repeated requests for reinforcement, resupply, and evacuation, many of which went unanswered or were delayed. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1943, Slovak soldiers continued to face guerrilla attacks, supply shortages, and deteriorating conditions. The security division, now depleted, lacked the capacity to fulfill its mission. Morale reached its lowest point. In some sectors, entire platoons refused to conduct patrols or requested transfer to rear areas. The German command, already stretched thin, responded with threats of disciplinary action, but had little ability to enforce compliance. By the end of 1943, the Slovak Security Division had effectively ceased to function as a coherent force. Elements of the division were pulled back to the western regions of Ukraine, while others were absorbed into German organized security commands. Some units were disarmed and used solely for labor or logistical support. The idea of a Slovak military contribution to the Axis war effort in the East was now more symbolic than strategic. In Bratislava, the political leadership publicly reaffirmed its loyalty to Germany, even as private communications reflected growing despair. The war, once framed as a path to national security and prestige, had become a liability. The following year would bring even greater challenges as resistance within Slovakia grew, and the consequences of alliance with the Reich became impossible to ignore. For the soldiers still stationed in the east, the long and uncertain road back had only begun. The beginning of 1944 marked a decisive turning point in Slovakia's involvement on the Eastern Front. With Soviet forces advancing rapidly westward and Axis defensive positions collapsing, the operational presence of Slovak troops in Ukraine entered its final and most chaotic phase. The Security Division, already weakened by desertions, casualties, and logistical exhaustion, found itself on the verge of dissolution. Meanwhile, events inside Slovakia began to shift as well, as the political consensus sustaining the alliance with Nazi Germany started to fracture under mounting internal and external pressure. The retreat of German and satellite forces from Ukraine in early 1944 brought renewed urgency to the question of what to do with remaining Slovak formations. The division, which had been reduced to fewer than 4,000 men, was scattered across multiple locations near Vinnytsia, Zhytomyr, and Berdyshev. Many units operated in isolation, with limited contact with higher command and often reliant on German logistical support that was itself overstretched or collapsing. Communications lines were severed frequently by partisan sabotage, and rail links essential for withdrawal were increasingly targeted by Soviet air and guerrilla forces. In this deteriorating environment, the priorities of Slovak commanders shifted from maintaining order to ensuring survival. Orders were issued to consolidate positions, abandon forward outposts, and begin phased withdrawals toward the western regions of Ukraine. However, coordinating these movements proved extremely difficult. Some detachments attempted to retreat independently, only to be ambushed or surrounded. Others simply disbanded under pressure, with officers ordering their men to surrender or seek refuge in German-held zones. Simultaneously, partisan activity reached its peak. Red Army organized partisan brigades, often supported by local populations, took control of vast areas in the rear. Slovak troops, now lacking armored support and in many cases functioning as infantry only, were no match for coordinated ambushes using mines, automatic weapons, and hit-and-run tactics. According to German reports from the period, Slovak units suffered significant casualties in the first quarter of 1944, losing hundreds of men, either killed, captured, or missing. The reliability of these forces was openly questioned by the Wehrmacht command. The loss of eastern Ukraine to Soviet forces by mid-1944 sealed the fate of the Slovak Security Division. As German formations fell back across the Carpathians, Slovak troops were either ordered to evacuate with them or transferred to static defense duties in Poland and Slovakia. In practice, many were left behind. Some Slovak soldiers were captured by advancing Soviet units. Others deserted or joined local resistance groups. A few attempted to blend in with the civilian population to avoid both German reprisals and Soviet captivity. Those who remained loyal and retreated with the Germans often faced accusations of unreliability or cowardice. Within German command circles, frustration with Slovakia grew. German liaison officers submitted critical memoranda to Berlin, suggesting that Slovak forces were no longer militarily useful and that their political loyalty was in doubt. These views were not entirely unfounded. In several cases, Slovak units refused to participate in punitive actions against civilians or declined to re-enter contested zones after suffering ambushes. Meanwhile, back in Slovakia, opposition to the war was intensifying. Resistance networks, many linked to former officers, members of the Slovak Democratic Party, or communists, began to organize more openly. They were supported covertly by the exiled Czechoslovak government in London and the Soviet intelligence apparatus. Disillusioned Slovak soldiers returning from the Eastern Front, often embittered by their experience or sympathetic to the partisan cause, became valuable assets in building underground military cells. The Slovak population, already weary of economic hardship, began to view the German alliance as a national liability rather than a protective partnership. Forced labor conscription, requisitions of food and materials, and visible German dominance over Slovak policy fueled resentment. Religious leaders, once supporters of the regime, began to express caution or silence in the face of mounting opposition. Even within the Hlinka Guard, the paramilitary arm of the regime, loyalty was no longer uniform. Some elements began secretly collaborating with the resistance or engaging in passive disobedience. In an attempt to reassert control, the Slovak government introduced stricter laws and expanded its internal security apparatus. The secret police, USB, increased arrests, conducted surveillance on known dissenters, and disrupted meetings of suspected anti-government groups. The Ministry of Defense attempted to recall experienced officers from the Eastern Front to form new internal units, but the results were limited. Too many of these officers returned disillusioned or physically and mentally unfit for further duty. By the summer of 1944, the gap between official rhetoric and reality had become unsustainable. On the battlefield, German defeats in Belarus during Operation Bagration created a crisis for all Axis-aligned regimes. The Red Army's advance to the borders of pre-war Poland and Slovakia raised the specter of direct invasion. Slovak intelligence officers warned that German forces were increasingly using Slovak territory for their own logistical and military purposes without consulting Bratislava. The perception of lost sovereignty grew more widespread, particularly among the officer corps. In this atmosphere of crisis, several senior Slovak military figures began to plan for a possible uprising. General Jan Golian, based in Banska Bystrica, emerged as a key coordinator of this effort. Working in secret with resistance leaders, Golian made contact with Soviet agents and began preparing a general insurrection to coincide with the anticipated Red Army advance. Many of the officers involved were veterans of the Eastern Front, familiar with German tactics and deeply skeptical of further alliance with Berlin. Meanwhile, the disintegration of Slovak forces in Ukraine accelerated. In July 1944, remnants of the Security Division were formally withdrawn and repatriated. The unit no longer existed as an effective formation. Its soldiers were reassigned to rear area duties, internal security tasks, or dispersed into garrison units across western Slovakia. Some were interrogated by the Slovak secret police for signs of defeatism or political unreliability. Others were quietly demobilized. Yet, the legacy of their deployment to the Soviet Union remained deeply divisive. For some, it was a campaign of national duty performed under difficult circumstances. For others, it had been a betrayal of Slovak sovereignty, a war waged on behalf of a foreign ideology, and a source of unnecessary suffering. Veterans returned home with physical scars, trauma, and in many cases, a desire to forget. Public recognition was minimal. The state did not organize large parades or award ceremonies. Instead, the war in the East became a subject of silence, remembered in private but rarely discussed openly. By August 1944, the pieces for an internal confrontation were nearly in place. The dissolution of Slovakia's presence on the Eastern Front, combined with Soviet advances and internal resistance mobilization, had created the conditions for open rebellion. What began in 1941 as a calculated gamble to secure the regime's future had, by 1944, evolved into a liability that threatened its very existence. In the final stages of the war, Slovakia would experience a dramatic internal rupture, one that would challenge the very foundation of the wartime state. In late August 1944, as the Red Army approached the eastern borders of Slovakia and internal resistance networks reached a critical level of readiness, the fragile balance of power within the Slovak Republic shattered. On August 29th, the Slovak National Uprising was launched, a full-scale armed insurrection led by dissident military officers and coordinated with Soviet and Allied efforts. The uprising would mark the culmination of years of growing disillusionment with the pro-German regime and represent the most significant domestic rupture within the Axis alliance in Central Europe. The decision to launch the uprising was driven by both opportunity and urgency. Following Romania's dramatic switch to the Allied side on August 23rd, German forces began moving rapidly to secure strategic corridors in Slovakia, fearing a similar defection. General Jan Golian, acting on prearranged signals from the London-based Czechoslovak government in exile and Soviet contacts, activated the insurgent plan. Units of the Slovak army, along with partisans and civilian volunteers, seized key cities such as Banska Bystrica, Zvolin, and Brezno. Communications with Bratislava were severed, and the insurgents declared allegiance to the Czechoslovak Republic. The uprising posed an immediate threat to Germany's lines of retreat from the Eastern Front and its control over the Carpathian passes. In response, the Wehrmacht moved swiftly. By early September, elite German units, including the 18th SS Panzergrenadier Division Horst Wessel, the 1st Waffen-SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and elements of the 178th Panzer Division were deployed into Slovakia. They were supported by Gestapo units, SD operatives, and Slovak collaborationist militias loyal to President Tiso's regime. German forces launched coordinated offensives from multiple directions. Their objective was to encircle and crush the uprising before it could link up with advancing Soviet forces. Despite initial insurgent successes, the superiority of German firepower, armor, and air support quickly shifted the balance. Luftwaffe dive bombers targeted partisan-held towns, rail stations, and suspected rebel camps. On the ground, SS and police units employed counterinsurgency tactics honed in the East. Reprisals, hostage executions, and forced evacuations. The Slovak insurgents, composed of regular army units, partisan brigades, and spontaneous civilian fighters, faced a severe shortage of arms, ammunition, and coordinated command. The initial force numbered around 18,000, with reinforcements bringing the total to over 35,000. However, only a fraction had modern rifles or machine guns. Artillery was limited, and armored support was minimal. Several captured or defecting Slovak tanks and aircraft provided temporary boosts, but these assets were quickly neutralized. As German forces advanced, the rebel-held zone contracted toward the mountainous region around Banská Bystrica, where the Slovak National Council established its headquarters. Soviet attempts to support the uprising from the east were hampered by logistical constraints and German blocking forces. Though some Soviet paratroopers and special operations groups reached the insurgents, the hoped-for direct link with the Red Army did not materialize in time. The Tiso government, still based in Bratislava, portrayed the uprising as a communist plot instigated by foreign agents. Propaganda emphasized loyalty to the Axis and denounced the rebels as traitors. German authorities, meanwhile, took direct control over military and administrative operations in the contested regions. Martial law was declared, and mass arrests followed. Summary executions of captured insurgents and suspected sympathizers were carried out in towns such as Ružomberok, Žilina, and Poprad. Despite the deteriorating situation, the insurgents continued to resist throughout September and October. Guerrilla warfare intensified in the Tatra and Low Fatra mountains. Makeshift hospitals treated the wounded in forests and caves. International attention briefly focused on Slovakia, with Allied radio broadcasts praising the courage of the resistance. Yet material support remained limited. The Allied strategic focus remained on Western Europe and the Balkans, while Soviet priorities were dictated by the need to advance through Hungary and into central Poland. As October drew to a close, the situation became untenable. On October 27th, German forces launched a final offensive. Banská Bystrica fell on October 29th. The leadership of the Slovak National Council dispersed, with some escaping to Soviet-held territory and others captured. General Golian and General Rudolf Viest, both key figures in the uprising, were arrested, tortured, and later executed by the SS. The organized phase of the uprising was effectively over, though partisan resistance continued in rural and mountainous areas well into the winter. For Germany, the suppression of the Slovak National Uprising was a tactical victory, but it came at a cost. Over 14,000 German troops had been required to quell the rebellion, diverting resources from the front. Infrastructure in central Slovakia was badly damaged, and the region was rendered politically unstable. Thousands of Slovak civilians were killed or displaced, and many towns experienced severe reprisals, including the destruction of entire villages. The massacre at Kremnička, where over 700 people, Jews, partisans, and civilians, were executed, became emblematic of the brutal German response. Following the suppression of the uprising, the Wehrmacht and SS reorganized control over Slovakia. The Hlinka Guard emergency divisions, reinforced and rearmed, took over much of the internal security role under German supervision. A wave of arrests, executions, and deportations followed. The Jewish population, already devastated by earlier deportations, faced renewed persecution. Remaining Jews in hiding were hunted down. German and Slovak collaborationist forces began clearing out suspected resistance cells with increasing brutality. Yet even as the uprising was crushed, its broader implications began to unfold. For the first time since 1939, the legitimacy of the Tiso regime had been openly and militarily challenged from within. Though defeated militarily, the insurgents had succeeded in demonstrating that significant portions of the Slovak population, including elements of the regular army, no longer supported continued alliance with Germany. In the eyes of the Allies, this gave post-war Czechoslovakia a stronger claim to national resistance status, which would later influence political settlements. From a military standpoint, the collapse of the uprising did not stabilize the situation for long. As Soviet and Romanian forces advanced through eastern Slovakia in late 1944 and early 1945, the German grip on the country began to unravel. The remaining months of the war would be marked by Soviet offensives, the final retreat of German troops, and the collapse of the Axis order in Central Europe. For Slovak soldiers, civilians, and political leaders, the events of autumn 1944 marked the most intense phase of suffering and reckoning. The split between collaboration and resistance had become irreparable. The state's peak alignment with Nazi Germany had reached its climax, and from that point forward, its disintegration was both inevitable and irreversible. The military collapse on the Eastern Front and the moral collapse of the wartime regime would converge in the final act of Slovakia's wartime experience. Following the suppression of the Slovak National Uprising in October 1944, the German occupation of Slovakia intensified into a full-scale military and administrative takeover. The Slovak state, still nominally independent under President Joseph Tiso, now functioned entirely under German control. The defeat of the uprising did not bring peace or stability. It merely marked the beginning of a new, more repressive phase, characterized by scorched earth warfare, mass reprisals, and the systematic erosion of state authority. In the wake of the uprising's collapse, the Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, and Ordnungspolizei launched wide-ranging anti-partisan operations across central and northern Slovakia. Dozens of villages were burned, thousands of civilians were arrested, and hundreds were executed. German intelligence officers, often working in coordination with the Hlinka Guard and local informants, sought to identify remaining resistance cells, arms caches, and partisan collaborators. Forests, mountain passes, and rural hamlets became the focus of daily security sweeps, supported by artillery and aerial reconnaissance. The remnants of the Slovak insurgent forces who had escaped the German encirclement retreated into the mountains, particularly the Low Tatras and Greater Fatra ranges. There, they reorganized into loosely coordinated partisan brigades, often joined by escaped Soviet POWs, Jews, and other fugitives. These formations operated in extremely difficult conditions, suffering from cold, hunger, disease, and constant German pressure. Their tactics centered on sabotage, ambushes, and intelligence gathering. Rail lines were mined, bridges destroyed, and fuel depots attacked. Communications with Soviet and Allied intelligence were maintained sporadically through couriers and radio transmissions. Despite their limited resources, the partisans posed a persistent challenge to German supply routes and internal control. Some units, such as the M.R. Stefanik Brigade and the Jan Žižka unit, developed into sizable forces, numbering hundreds of fighters. Others remained small, mobile groups that avoided direct confrontation. The Germans responded with increasingly brutal countermeasures. In some cases, entire communities were accused of supporting partisans and subjected to collective punishment. The massacre in Ostry Grün and Klak in January 1945, where over 140 civilians were killed by Waffen-SS and Hlinka Guard units, became symbolic of the occupation's final phase. The Hlinka Guard emergency divisions, reorganized after the uprising, now functioned as German auxiliaries. While officially under Slovak command, these formations reported directly to SS and SD officers. They participated in arrests, interrogations, and field executions. Their knowledge of the terrain and local populations made them effective trackers of partisan activity, but their involvement in extrajudicial killings and looting further alienated the Slovak population. Many of their members acted out of fear, opportunism, or ideological commitment, while others joined simply to avoid forced labor or deportation. Amidst the rising violence, Slovakia's infrastructure continued to collapse. Rail transport was disrupted by constant sabotage and Allied air raids. Food supplies dwindled, and rationing became more severe. Urban centers like Banska Bystrica, Košice, and Žilina suffered bombings that destroyed factories, depots, and housing. Refugees from eastern Slovakia, fleeing the Soviet advance, streamed westward, placing further strain on local resources. Disease outbreaks, especially typhus and dysentery, became common in overcrowded towns and rural shelters. President Tiso's regime remained in place, but its capacity to govern was symbolic at best. Policy decisions were either dictated or directly implemented by German authorities. key ministries were overseen by German advisors, and military command had been entirely supplanted by Wehrmacht and SS structures. Tiso continued to issue public statements calling for loyalty to the Axis cause and denouncing communism, but his influence over military or civil affairs was negligible. Nonetheless, the Slovak state continued to function in bureaucratic terms. Courts, police, and local administrators remained active, even as real power shifted to German hands. Some officials tried to maintain order or mitigate German excesses, while others deepened their collaboration. German intelligence increasingly relied on Slovak informants to penetrate resistance networks, often using threats against families or promises of exemption from labor duty as leverage. Within this environment, the persecution of Jews resumed with full force. Although the mass deportations of 1942 had already destroyed much of Slovakia's Jewish population, several thousand Jews had remained in hiding or in protected labor camps. After the uprising, German and Slovak units launched systematic raids to locate and eliminate these survivors. Mobile killing squads, often composed of German SD personnel with Linke Guard support, conducted executions on the spot. Some Jews were deported to Auschwitz or other camps in the general government, while others were shot in mass graves in the Slovak countryside. The civilian population found itself caught between collapsing German authority, violent partisan warfare, and the approach of the Soviet front. For many, survival depended on pragmatism. Some cooperated with whichever side controlled their region. Others withdrew into rural isolation. Women and children bore the brunt of the instability, facing food shortages, violence, and displacement. Religious institutions attempted to provide shelter and aid, but were themselves under constant scrutiny. At the same time, preparations were quietly underway for a final political realignment. In exile, the Czechoslovak government under Edvard Beneš pressed the Allies to recognize Slovak resistance as part of a unified national liberation movement. Soviet authorities, while cautious about Western-aligned politicians, supported partisan coordination in the Carpathians and encouraged local uprisings. Clandestine Soviet missions parachuted into Slovak territory, bringing weapons, advisors, and radio equipment. These efforts laid the groundwork for post-war claims of Slovak contribution to victory, an issue that would shape historical memory long after the war ended. By early 1945, as Soviet forces pushed through Hungary and into the northern Carpathians, German control over Slovakia began to collapse in earnest. The eastern regions were liberated in stages by elements of the First Ukrainian and Second Ukrainian fronts, often with Romanian forces operating under Soviet command. German units, caught in retreat and hounded by partisans, began withdrawing toward Austria and Bohemia. Roadblocks, mined passes, and destroyed bridges slowed the retreat, and German losses mounted. In February and March, partisan units began emerging from hiding and re-establishing open control over liberated towns. Cooperation with advancing Soviet forces increased. In some cases, former insurgents guided Red Army units through mountain passes or helped identify remaining German strongpoints. With the front line approaching Bratislava, the last phase of Axis occupation drew to a close. The final weeks of the war in Slovakia were marked by chaos, fragmentation, and violent reckoning. Collaborationist officials fled or attempted to go into hiding. Others were captured by resistance units and summarily executed or imprisoned. The wartime Slovak state, once presented as a stable and independent ally of Nazi Germany, had been reduced to a puppet administration presiding over devastation. Yet within this collapse, new political structures began to emerge. Local national committees, often composed of partisans, communists, and returning exiles, assumed provisional authority in liberated towns. These bodies coordinated with Soviet military authorities and prepared for the restoration of Czechoslovak rule. For the surviving fighters, civilians, and political organizers, the focus now shifted from resistance to reconstruction, and from wartime allegiances to post-war positioning. The legacy of the conflict would linger, but the battle for the future had already begun. As March turned to April 1945, the final collapse of the Axis position in Slovakia accelerated. The Red Army, spearheaded by the Second Ukrainian Front under Marshal Malinovsky, launched its final operations across the central and western regions of the country. German resistance, increasingly fragmented and disorganized, relied on ad hoc formations of Wehrmacht infantry, SS units, and local auxiliaries. In a matter of weeks, Soviet forces swept through the remaining Axis-controlled territories, encountering sporadic but often fierce opposition in mountain passes and fortified towns. On March 25, 1945, Soviet and Czechoslovak forces captured Banska Bystrica, a symbolic moment that marked the re-liberation of the center of the Slovak National Uprising. Red Army columns advanced westward with the aim of reaching Bratislava and closing the corridor between Hungary and Austria. German units attempted to conduct delaying actions, blowing up bridges, planting mines, and using rear guards to slow the Soviet advance. Nonetheless, their capacity to hold territory was exhausted. Fuel shortages, supply collapse, and mass desertions hollowed out formations that once held large swathes of the Eastern Front. For the civilian population, the final weeks of the war were marked by anticipation and terror in equal measure. Many feared reprisals from Soviet troops or chaos as authority broke down. Others viewed the advancing Soviets as liberators. Partisan groups that had operated in secrecy now emerged publicly to seize control of towns, disarm remaining Axis sympathizers, and coordinate with incoming Soviet commanders. In villages such as Detava, Liptovsky Mikuláš, and Martin, local national committees raised Czechoslovak flags and issued proclamations of liberation. Bratislava, the capital of the wartime Slovak Republic, fell on April 4, 1945. Red Army tanks entered the city from the east, while German defenders staged a brief but determined resistance before withdrawing toward the Austrian border. President Joseph Tiso and members of his inner circle had already fled, taking refuge in a Benedictine monastery in Kremsmünster, Austria, under SS protection. The capital was left in disarray. Government ministries were abandoned, police stations empty, and only skeletal municipal services remained operational. The swift Soviet takeover occurred with relatively limited destruction, though looting, arrests, and sporadic violence followed in its wake. Across the country, the remnants of the Axis presence disintegrated. German columns retreating through Slovakia came under repeated attack from Soviet aircraft and partisans. Many convoys were ambushed or destroyed in mountain passes. Others surrendered en masse. Slovak collaborationist units, including segments of the Hlinka Guard and auxiliary police, attempted to flee westward or discard their uniforms. In some cases, they were captured by Soviet or Czechoslovak forces. In others, they were seized by vengeful civilians or former resistance fighters. Amid this military collapse, a political transformation began. Representatives of the Czechoslovak government in exile, backed by the Soviet Union, began re-establishing formal authority. In cities like Košice, provisional administrative councils composed of communists, social democrats, and former resistance members issued decrees, reasserted Czechoslovak sovereignty, and began purging collaborators from positions of power. The Košice government program, issued on April 5th, laid out the foundations of the post-war state: land reform, nationalization of key industries, prosecution of war criminals, and alignment with the Soviet Union. This rapid political transition placed significant pressure on those associated with the wartime Slovak regime. Former army officers, bureaucrats, and members of the Hlinka Slovak People's Party were arrested, interrogated, or dismissed. Some tried to claim that their collaboration had been motivated by pragmatism or coercion. Others attempted to flee or destroy incriminating documents. The Soviet NKVD, operating alongside Czechoslovak security forces, compiled lists of individuals for arrest, drawing on partisan intelligence, local denunciations, and captured records. The fate of Joseph Tiso became a central question. Captured by American troops in Austria in May 1945, he was eventually extradited to Czechoslovakia. There, he would face trial for collaboration, treason, and complicity in crimes against humanity. His case symbolized the legal and moral reckoning that awaited the former leadership. Other high-ranking figures, Wojtek Tuka, Ferdynand Jurchansky, Alexander Mach, were also detained, though some managed to evade immediate capture and escape to Western Europe or Latin America. On the ground, the final stages of combat in Slovakia remained violent. The retreating German 8th Army and elements of Army Group South fought desperate holding actions to allow as many troops as possible to reach Austria and surrender to the Western Allies. Towns like Trencin and Nitra witnessed intense shelling, urban combat, and widespread destruction. Civilian casualties mounted, particularly in areas where German troops used local residents as forced labor or human shields during their retreat. Simultaneously, Red Army military tribunals and Soviet political officers oversaw the restructuring of Slovak administrative and security systems. In many cases, communist partisans who had fought in the mountains were installed as local leaders. Factories and mines were placed under state supervision. Rail and telegraph lines were repaired under military authority. While the official restoration of Czechoslovakia was proclaimed, it was increasingly clear that post-war Slovakia would be shaped by Soviet interests and communist political structures. The repatriation of Slovak soldiers from the Eastern Front and other theaters of war unfolded in stages. Some had been captured by the Soviets and held in temporary camps. Others had surrendered to Western forces and were returned under Allied agreements. Upon return, many faced screening processes to determine their wartime conduct. Those suspected of collaboration or of serving in German-controlled units such as the Schutzstaffel were imprisoned or barred from public life. Others reintegrated quietly into society, their service in the East overlooked or deliberately forgotten in the broader push for national unity. As May 1945 arrived and Germany formally capitulated, Slovakia stood amid the ruins of war, occupation, and internal conflict. Over 6,000 Slovak Jews had perished during the war. Entire villages had been destroyed. The economy was shattered. Infrastructure, already underdeveloped before the conflict, was in urgent need of rebuilding. The population, traumatized by years of repression, propaganda, and violence, faced an uncertain future in a state that was both restored and transformed. Yet, despite the devastation, a new political narrative began to take hold, one that emphasized resistance over collaboration, martyrdom over complicity. The Slovak National Uprising was elevated as the centerpiece of wartime memory. Former partisans were hailed as national heroes. Streets were renamed, monuments erected, and school curricula rewritten to align with the post-war consensus. This process would continue and intensify under communist rule, but its roots lay in the immediate aftermath of liberation. In the final analysis, Slovakia's participation in the Axis war effort on the Eastern Front had ended not with battlefield defeat alone, but with political repudiation and societal rupture. The soldiers who had once fought in Ukraine and Russia returned to a country that no longer recognized the cause for which they had been sent. Their experience, complex, contradictory, and often silenced, was left on the margins of a nation eager to turn the page and begin again. The cessation of hostilities in May 1945 brought an end to formal combat operations across Slovakia, but it did not conclude the consequences of the war, particularly for those who had participated in the conflict on the Eastern Front. In the months following the German surrender, Slovakia, now reincorporated into the restored Czechoslovak Republic, underwent a period of rapid political transformation, legal retribution, and social reconstruction. The retributive justice aimed at collaborators, the reassessment of military service, and the attempts to reestablish civil order all converged in a complex aftermath that reflected both the chaos of wartime collapse and the political ambitions of the post-war regime. One of the earliest priorities of the reconstituted Czechoslovak state was the legal reckoning with individuals who had supported or served the wartime Slovak Republic. While military defeat had already dissolved many of the political structures of the Tiso regime, public accountability and symbolic justice remained vital to the legitimacy of the post-war order. A series of People's Tribunals, Ludové súdy, were established under the so-called retribution decrees. These courts were empowered to try individuals accused of collaboration, treason, or participation in fascist and German-controlled institutions. The trials targeted high-ranking officials, propagandists, Hlinka Guard members, and military personnel. Józef Tiso, extradited from Austria in 1946, stood as the most prominent figure to face justice. His trial, conducted in Bratislava, lasted several months and included testimonies from survivors, former officials, and international observers. The charges against him included state treason, support for Nazi Germany, and responsibility for the deportation of Slovak Jews. Despite appeals from the Vatican and segments of the population, Tiso was sentenced to death and executed on April 18, 1947. His fate symbolized both the moral reckoning and the deep divisions within Slovak society. For the thousands of former soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front, the post-war environment was more ambiguous. While the upper echelons of the wartime military hierarchy were often removed from public life or placed under investigation, the majority of rank-and-file soldiers were neither celebrated nor overtly condemned. Their service was typically treated with silence. In contrast to former partisans who were integrated into the new military and administrative structures, Eastern Front veterans often found themselves excluded from public honors or employment in state institutions. The Czechoslovak government's policy was shaped by practical and political considerations. On the one hand, the new authorities needed to avoid alienating large segments of the male population who had been mobilized under the previous regime. On the other, the dominant narrative emphasized resistance and anti-fascist struggle. This left little room for complex accounts of reluctant service, coerced loyalty, or survival-driven collaboration. Many veterans chose to suppress or conceal their wartime experiences, avoiding questions and focusing on rebuilding their personal lives in a changed society. For civilians, the immediate post-war period was marked by dislocation and deprivation. Vast numbers of homes, farms, and businesses had been destroyed or looted. Food shortages continued well into 1946, exacerbated by poor harvests and disrupted transportation. Inflation and currency reform added to economic instability. The return of demobilized soldiers, prisoners of war, and displaced persons strained local communities and municipal administrations. Housing shortages, unemployment, and outbreaks of disease required urgent state intervention. Ethnic tensions also intensified. The end of the war marked the beginning of the mass expulsion of ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia, a policy agreed upon at the Potsdam Conference and implemented with varying degrees of organization and violence. In Slovakia, this affected the Carpathian German minority, some of whom had served in German military or police units. Their property was confiscated and most were deported to occupied Germany or interned in camps. This process, while framed as a security measure and act of national justice, further altered the demographic and cultural landscape of Slovakia. The Jewish survivors of the Holocaust faced their own post-war ordeal. Of the approximately 89,000 Jews living in Slovakia before the war, only a fraction, estimates range between 1,000 and 15,000, survived. Many returned to find their communities destroyed, their synagogues desecrated, and their homes and businesses occupied or nationalized. Legal restitution was slow and often obstructed by bureaucratic indifference or local hostility. Anti-Semitic incidents, including attacks and looting, occurred in several towns in 1945 and 1946, a bitter reminder that liberation did not immediately erase the prejudices cultivated during the war. In political terms, the post-war period saw the rapid consolidation of power by the Czechoslovak Communist Party. Though initially part of a coalition government, the Communists held key ministries, particularly in security, defense, and propaganda, and controlled the apparatus necessary for surveillance and political influence. Many former partisans, especially those aligned with communist ideology, were placed in leadership roles at the local and national levels. The legacy of the uprising was interpreted through a partisan lens, and the Eastern Front veterans, particularly those seen as loyal to the Tiso regime, were marginalized in public discourse. Educational and cultural institutions also reshaped the historical narrative. Textbooks, museums, and public commemorations emphasized the heroism of the anti-fascist struggle and the betrayal of the wartime Slovak elite. The contribution of Slovak troops to the Axis war effort in Ukraine and Russia was minimized or omitted. Instead, the official memory focused on resistance, martyrdom, and the restoration of Czechoslovak unity. Over time, the silence surrounding Slovakia's role as a German ally became institutionalized, with few spaces available for open reflection or academic debate. Amid this political and social reordering, the process of physical reconstruction proceeded unevenly. Some towns and cities, such as Košice and Bratislava, received prioritized investment due to their administrative importance. Others remained damaged and neglected for years. Industrial output was gradually restored, with nationalization efforts targeting key sectors. The state directed labor to major infrastructure projects, while rationing and price controls remained in place. For most Slovaks, daily life in the immediate post-war years was marked by scarcity, uncertainty, and adaptation to new political realities. The broader geopolitical shift also influenced Slovakia's future. As the Cold War emerged, Czechoslovakia found itself firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. Soviet troops remained on Slovak soil until mid-1945, and Soviet advisors continued to shape internal policies. The political space for dissent narrowed rapidly. By 1948, a full communist takeover would erase the remaining pluralism of the post-war system. Those who had fought on the Eastern Front under German command, whether as regular soldiers or auxiliaries, had no place in the new ideological order. Their past service became a liability, evidence of bourgeois nationalism or reactionary tendencies. Surveillance by the STB, state security, intensified, and records of wartime affiliation were quietly incorporated into personal files. In some cases, former officers were rearrested in the 1950s during purges targeting perceived enemies of the people. Others simply faded into anonymity, their wartime roles neither publicly acknowledged nor officially condemned. The experience of Slovakia's soldiers on the Eastern Front thus became a historical blind spot, unwelcome in the triumphalist narratives of resistance, incompatible with the black and white moral categories of post-war ideology. Their story would remain buried in personal memory, whispered in private, or recorded in inaccessible military archives. Only decades later, with the fall of communism and the reopening of historical discourse, would scholars begin to re-examine this dimension of Slovakia's wartime history in full. But in the immediate post-war years, the priority was reconstruction, political control, and the forging of a new national identity, one in which the Eastern Front had no place. In the decades following the war, the Slovak Republic's participation as a German ally on the Eastern Front remained a largely suppressed chapter in the collective memory of Czechoslovakia. While public discourse focused heavily on resistance, the Slovak National Uprising, and the crimes of the Nazi regime, the deployment of Slovak troops in Ukraine and Russia, their integration into the Axis military apparatus, and their role in the occupation of Soviet territories received minimal acknowledgement. This silence was not accidental. It was a product of political expediency, ideological control, and the post-war state's effort to construct a unified national narrative rooted in anti-fascist legitimacy. Under the communist regime established after the 1948 coup, historical interpretation became a tightly controlled tool of state policy. The official historiography, supervised by party-affiliated institutions, reinforced a binary vision of the wartime period, the fascist puppet regime on one side, and the anti-fascist resistance guided by the proletarian cause on the other. Within this framework, there was no room for the nuanced complexities of the thousands of Slovak soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front, not all of them by choice, not all of them with conviction, but all of them now inconvenient to the ruling political order. Those who had served in the security division, the mobile group, or in auxiliary functions alongside the Wehrmacht were excluded from state commemoration. Their service was politically suspect, and their stories were considered morally compromised. In practice, most veterans kept silent. Some concealed their military records. Others passed their wartime years into obscurity. Official veterans organizations made no space for them, and local commemorations avoided mention of their units or campaigns. Their participation was not forgotten entirely. Rumors and family stories persisted, but it was left unspoken in public forums. This official silence was reinforced by broader geopolitical dynamics. As the Cold War deepened, the Soviet Union exerted growing influence over the interpretation of history across Eastern Europe. The Red Army's victory over Nazi Germany became the central foundational myth of socialist states, emphasizing the suffering of Soviet civilians and the heroism of the Red Army, left little appetite for acknowledging the presence of foreign Axis-aligned troops in the USSR, including those from Slovakia. Any admission of such facts risked undermining the legitimacy of the post-war order and the moral authority of Soviet liberation. Yet this enforced amnesia was never complete. In private archives, family correspondence, and military documents quietly stored in the Ministry of Defense, the record of Slovak participation remained intact. Scholars during the communist era occasionally alluded to these deployments, but their work was heavily censored or buried in inaccessible journals. Only in the late 1980s, amid the gradual liberalization of Czechoslovak political life, did a few historians begin to explore the subject with greater candor. The Velvet Revolution of 1989 and the subsequent dissolution of Czechoslovakia in 1993 created a new space for historical inquiry. In the Slovak Republic, now independent, historians began re-examining controversial aspects of the wartime period, including collaboration, resistance, and the role of the wartime Slovak state. This re-examination was not without controversy. Public debates erupted over the legacy of Josef Tiso, the legitimacy of the wartime regime, and the competing narratives of national survival versus moral complicity. In this emerging historiographical landscape, the Eastern Front deployments of Slovak troops came under renewed scrutiny. Military records, personal diaries, and German operational files were examined. Researchers traced the movement of Slovak units, the composition of their forces, and their integration into the occupation framework. Oral history projects collected testimonies from surviving veterans, many of whom, after decades of silence, spoke cautiously about their experiences. These interviews revealed a complex range of motivations. Some soldiers saw service as a patriotic duty, others as coerced obligation. Some acknowledged participation in the harsh anti-partisan operations, others emphasized efforts to protect civilians or resist German pressure. This more nuanced historical account gradually entered public consciousness, though it remained politically sensitive. School curricula began to include brief references to Slovak involvement on the Eastern Front, though often without in-depth analysis. Documentaries and public forums occasionally addressed the subject, but it did not displace the dominant narrative centered on the Slovak National Uprising. Monuments and commemorations continued to prioritize resistance fighters, while memorials for soldiers who died in Ukraine or Russia remained rare. For many families, the reopening of this chapter offered a kind of belated recognition. Soldiers who had returned in silence, stigmatized or ignored, were acknowledged as part of a broader national story, one marked by complexity rather than moral certainty. Their experiences shed light not only on the nature of Slovakia's wartime alliance, but also on the human costs of political decisions made by a regime that had tied its survival to a totalitarian power. The historical significance of Slovakia's Eastern Front campaign lies not in its military impact, which, in the grand scope of World War II, was modest, but in what it reveals about the choices made by small states under pressure, the limits of sovereignty under occupation, and the moral ambiguities of war. Slovakia's alliance with Nazi Germany was not merely the result of ideological alignment, but of geopolitical calculation, fear of Hungarian irredentism, economic dependence, and authoritarian consolidation. Its participation in the war against the Soviet Union was, at once, a demonstration of loyalty, a gamble for territorial security, and a reflection of the broader dynamics of Central European politics in the shadow of the Reich. Today, historians continue to piece together the Slovak experience on the Eastern Front, drawing from military dispatches, intelligence reports, and Soviet archives. Each document adds to a fuller picture, one that neither absolves nor condemns, but seeks to understand. It is a history that resists simplification, one in which soldiers were not merely pawns, but participants whose lives were shaped by the ideological, strategic, and national currents of their time. In remembering Slovakia's secret war on the Eastern Front, we are reminded that history is rarely clean. It unfolds not in slogans or myths, but in the muddy fields of occupied Ukraine, the frozen forests of Belarus, the courtyards of partisan villages, and the bureaucratic corridors of wartime ministries. It is in these places that we find the real legacy of Slovakia's wartime choices, not only in what was done, but in what was forgotten, and in what remains to be understood.